today we have with us a very good friend of mine who I've known for 10 plus years now, Jasmin Jenkins, who is a grief guide. She's created a framework around the 4 invitations of grief, and she's going to speak about her own initiation. Her path has not been linear. Before moving into this work, she worked in the mission-driven startup space in New York City and then in LA, where she lives now. But her work has been alive within her for many, many years. And it was all part of the future entering into her in order to transform her into the person willing to embody her calling. When she was 15, her mother died from cancer. And then 10 years later, her brother committed suicide. In between, her dad also left to a different continent. With all of this, she was invited by spirit into a deep healing journey. And upon arriving at the place where her grief had been alchemized from something that she was bound by into something that emboldened her and empowered her, she felt her calling reverberate throughout her soul. So Jasmin is here today I'm going to ask her a few questions, the first half, and then as a group, we'll lead a discussion, and we would like this to be interactive and allow people to share, ask questions, to understand how to apply her framework to your own, growth around grief, spiritual growth around grief. So thank you, Jasmin. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Talia. I'm grateful to be here with you. This is really special, and it's really full circle to be here with you. So yeah, it's beautiful. And thank you to everybody who is present here. I can't see you, but I feel you, and I'm grateful to be here with you.
Awesome. Yeah. And if people have, towards the second half, people want to type questions into the chat box or raise your hand, and then we can call on you and you can ask questions or make comments. That's great too. So yeah, feel free to just chat away, and we'll take questions and comments. And so really the first question I had around you being a grief guide is grief just about death? Like death and, the finality of life? Or
it's not, thank you for the question. It's definitely not just about death. Grief, there's a whole spectrum of grief, and at the most fundamental level, grief occurs when we have an unmet expectation, any unmet expectation. And I think most of us, when we're honest with ourselves, we probably had an expectation that we weren't going to be in our lifetime. We probably weren't going to have to live through a global pandemic in the way that we are right now. So it's about expectation at the most fundamental level. Absolutely, death brings on grief, but there's the spectrum of grief. And right now, I think more so than ever, we're all very aware that there's this feeling in the air, and so much of it is grief, because there's a lot that this is bringing up for each one of us. Does that make sense?
Makes
Talia, to you?
sense.
Okay.
Yes. So what is a grief guide exactly?
So I work one-on-one with my clients, who I don't consider to be clients. I consider them to be co-creators in healing, because it's not about a transaction, it's about transformation. So I work with people one-on-one, and then I also do virtual workshops and in-person workshops. But my intention is to come alongside those who are on the spectrum of grief, and to support them in finding, as you spoke to in the intro, finding the invitations within their grief. Because so often, grief happens, and the grief takes us out of our hearts and into our heads to protect our hearts. And the softening and the healing happens when we can approach the grief from a new angle and see, okay, what is here for me to grow through?
I think this is really amazing, because in our society, there's a lot of focus on birth and, wanting to feel good and wanting to feel happiness. And really, there's a lot of fear around looking at various forms of grief. So I'm wondering, I know a little bit about your background, a lot about your background, but what led you to want to focus on grief work? And I'm curious about some of the teachers you may have had along the way.
Sure. So, as you shared in the intro, one of my favorite Rilke-isms is from Letters to a Young Poet, and it's the future enters into us in order to transform itself in us long before it happens. And I think my path entered into me long before I ever actually had the grief that's initiated by death. And I was the weird college student who would go and volunteer at the nursing home and support those who are getting ready to transition. So I was doing the work informally before I started doing the work, and I always knew that I wanted to be connected to a deeper mission, but I really I had to clear through my own grief, so that I wasn't, as you said, so that I wasn't bound by it, but that it was something that that launched me into wanting to be of service. So, I really believe that for those of us that have callings, it's because the universe, God, however you want to word it, whatever nomenclature you want to use, is we're being asked to do something that is uniquely ours to do. And so that's where I feel like my work as a grief guide comes in, and it's unique work, and it's interesting and beautiful. And a lot of times people ask me if it's hard, but I really feel like when we're in our calling, there's such a depth of joy that it transcends the difficulty. So.
Yeah, and I can't even imagine what it's like to lose your mother, to cancer, and then your brother to, in the way that you lost him. And knowing you, it's made you such a strong, positive person. Like, you've come out the other side, and I know it's taken you years, but you've come out the other side so incredibly positive and kind and loving of others and of yourself. So I think this work that you've discovered, that this framework of the 4 intentions of grief, coming from your own work, is very powerful. And I'm really interested in hearing more about the 4 invitations, if you can share those, and how you first applied those to your life, and then of course how others can apply them.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for the empathy that you reflected. And I think that everybody who's present on this call connects with grief in some way. And the reality is that, the invitation with COVID-19 is that it's brought us into the universality of grief. So there's, that is what is present for most of us. And then, some of it is, there's a full spectrum that's happening right now. But with respect to your question around the invitations, so grief can be so messy and so complicated and confusing. And I really asked for a spiritual download to support the people that I co-create in healing with. And I received the 4 invitations. And, it's a very simple framework that allows for there just to be clarity. And okay, the first invitation is to pause, and that's what we're in right now. If we choose to embrace it that way, most of us are self-quarantining, we're isolating, we're physical distancing. So the pause is how can we embrace the pause? By going into ourselves and going into our stories and going into whatever it is that this is bringing up, whether we're dealing with a sick loved one, whether we're sick ourselves, whether we're having financial fears. How can we be still and get quiet and continue breathing through what's being brought up? And they're kind of parameters, Talia, if you want to think about it that way. They're parameters that allow for grief to become a garden of sorts, allow for us to grow. So pause, breathe, feel, and heal. And my intention, unlike I think some other people in this space, is not to have my co-creators in healing forever. My intention is really to bring them from the pause into the healing, so that they have the tools in order to know how to navigate grief when it comes up. So yeah, navigating and knowing that, not dissimilar to, you know, the stages of grief, you don't necessarily navigate these with linearity, but they are there as reference points. And I mean, I'm human. I get overwhelmed by my grief sometimes, and or just what's going on right now. And I really make, like, pause, breathe, feel, heal. Like, I make that a mantra for myself sometimes. But depending on where my co-creator in healing is in their grief journey, will go into the invitation that's calling to them. So I empower them to really use their intuition to say, you know what, today, my invitation, I need to feel for the next 50 minutes. And I need to talk about that. And otherwise, or it can just be like, I need to breathe. I need to work on my breath, my anchor throughout the volatility, the inevitable volatility of emotions that come up when we have these really, you know, scary experiences. So,
Yeah. Well, that's very helpful. I think one of the questions we have, and I have, other people have, is what grief look like, and maybe touch on the things that we don't realize are grief, because I think identifying situations as grief is one of the hardest parts, you know.
Mm-hmm. What does grief look like? Well, I think it's, you know, in order to answer that question, you have to take it from the head to the heart. And grief is it's a universal experience, and it's a feeling, and it's a word that represents many different feelings. So sometimes, you know, sometimes grief can look like joy, like your baby Dash. Sometimes grief can look like tears. Sometimes it can look like getting on your knees and being in that complete place of surrender. But it's a path, and it is there for us to move through, and to stay connected. The healing is in staying connected, and to remembering that everything belongs, every emotion, that your specific grief, because your grief, Talia, is as unique as your fingerprint. Like, I know you've worked through a lot of grief in your life, and everybody's grief is going to be uniquely theirs and yours. So it requires a gentleness and kindness and compassion, to move through it, and to allow it to be a place for expansion, because there's the contraction that happens when we're in that place. Like right now, we're contracted, we're indoors, we're not doing for most of us, we're not doing what we normally do. And still we can grow.
So to be more concrete, grief, it can be a loss of old experiences that you were used to doing, and it can be stress, it can be anxiety, not just death or disease. You know,
No, it can be, I mean, there's a lot of grief happening right now. Everything from, you know, weddings getting canceled to people in the ICU with their loved ones. So it's going back to expectations. And I had this expectation that this thing was going to happen, and then guess what? It doesn't happen, and we're over here. So, yeah, it's hard to concretize something that isn't. It's abstract, you know, because yeah.
Okay, great. That is very helpful.
You're reading the chats? Okay. You'd also asked about my teachers, Talia. Harshita Wagner was one of my first teachers. He's an amazing meditation teacher. If you are curious about him, he teaches through glow.com, and he does his own retreats. Harshita is a really powerful teacher in my life. And I have studied with some different shamanic teachers in the plant medicine world, and I'm being mentored by a poet right now, Layla Delia, who's graciously taken me under her wing. So I think we have to we always want to have teachers and keep asking the questions so that we can keep finding the answers that bring us into aliveness. Dash is
Sorry,
hi Dash.
My toddler is trying to nurse and his hand is coming up. I think what would be helpful before we open this up is if you could take like the loss of a relationship right now and apply the 4 invitations to it as an example.
Sure. Like, what kind of a relationship are we talking about?
You know, losing a breakup of sorts. Breakup.
Okay. All right. Sure. So yeah, I would, when you have a breakup, even if it's initiated by both people, there's still a clearing that needs to happen. You need to own your part and acknowledge why you created that relationship and why you created that dynamic, and acknowledge what is coming to the forefront of your heart. What are the invitations for your heart? So do you need to pause, and do you need to really go into yourself so that you, depending on the severity of the ending, to pause, to be with yourself, to nurture yourself, to settle yourself with your breath, and then to really say, okay, what was true about this, and what felt amazing about this, and what felt healing about this, and then where is there grief to look at and to nurture. I mean, I think we've all had our fair share of breakups, and every breakup rather has grief. And I think extending this out to our current situation, we are all having to deal with the idea of a breakup in different ways. Most of us have broken up with routine. Most of us have broken up with, physically connecting with people that we love. And it's just so much has been disrupted. So how can we continue to belong and stay connected to our wholeness despite everything that has kind of blown up, for lack of a better descriptor. But yeah, I mean, a breakup can cause real grief, because a lot of times you're with a person and it's very much like a marriage. So you kind of sometimes have to take a breakup like a divorce.
Ash, thank you very much. Yeah, that's helpful. Ashley asks, how can people who are handling the grief of an unstable financial future work with the 4 invitations, given the current COVID environment?
Yep, absolutely. And that's a very real thing that I think all of us are dealing with in certain ways. So it's going into, okay, my breath. I think that's such an important thing right now, is using our breath as a resource, because when we look at, if we're in a place of scarcity and we're looking at our Quicken or our Excel docs, and it's not where we need it to be, and we're in a place of fear, it's like it takes us out of our breath. So the invitation is really to breathe and to reach out. And if prayer is a modality for you, I think I always say that prayer is the 5th invitation. If this is part of what you're navigating, Abraham Hicks is an amazing resource for navigating financial grief, for sure. But it's a complicated and layered story, and it's really one breath at a time, and taking it like line by line. I don't have all of the answers for everybody's financial journeys. I wish I did. Everybody's financial journey is uniquely their own, and there's lots there. So
fantastic. Yeah. Okay, and when you work with people, how do you work with them? Is there a minimum amount of time? Is it one-on-ones? Obviously you do groups sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, I do groups, and I used to do them in person, but now I've moved to doing virtual groups for the foreseeable future. And yeah, working one-on-one, I like to do a minimum of 1 month container, because there's so much that happens in one session. And if we can work together over 3 months, like I've seen so much transformation happen, and really the thing that somebody comes to me for really ends up being a metaphor for something that is completely, it wasn't the thing that brought us together, but there's a lot of healing that can happen in those sacred 3 months. But I think at a minimum, from the work that I've been doing since last year when I moved into my calling, it's 3 months. But I do work with people, just given what's happening right now. I do work with people just one-on-one, because I want to be of service, especially during this time when so much is coming forward to be healed.
Beautiful. Lauren asks, how is your work similar and different from psychotherapy? I believe Lauren's a psychotherapist. So
yeah, sure. So I'm not, I think the main differentiator, Lauren, is that I'm spirit-led. I actually worked with Dr. Henry Cloud last year before I moved into my work. And I didn't feel called to go into that specific field. I wanted to have the flexibility of being true to the deeper layers of my work, which are rooted in plant medicine and the shamanic realm. And I didn't see space for that in that field, if that answers your question.
So do people, you work with people, I'm assuming they also work with psychotherapists if necessary, and a bunch.
Yeah, and there are some people that I just will say, I'm so glad that we connected, but I think that this is somebody who could better support you. So I'm more than happy to acknowledge that, there's certain situations that I don't feel called to serve. Yeah.
Great. So you assess and then you guys discuss as like a team,
yes.
like that you're co-creators, there's not a hierarchy, which is, I think, part of what is troubling in the Western philosophy or the Western model. It's nice that you were doing the work together. Lauren,
and just to clarify, sorry, Talia, to interrupt you, but one of my mentors is a therapist. So I think that, therapy is absolutely important. And I do have that accountability in my work, kind of just the spiritual kind of chain. I have somebody who is specifically trained. So I have a sounding board there, an energetic and emotional sounding board. But I hope that answers your question, Lauren.
Yeah, that, and the second question is interesting too, because since your work is more spiritual based, Lauren asks, so what ways do you help your co-creators find meaning in their losses? I see, like spiritual meaning, emotional meaning.
Sure. So sometimes it's a tangible invitation, the invitation to create an altar, to bring ritual into the invitation to heal. So it's, a lot of times there's this heaviness and this weightiness and sense of overwhelm with grief. But I really endeavor to bring lightness in and a sense of play, and like, let's, bring the ritual to connecting with your late fill in the blank person into your morning ritual. And every morning, this is something that I offered to a co-creator in healing recently. Like every morning when she's drinking her coffee, she's inviting that conversation with her late father into her morning routine. So it's opening up. I always say, like, life can be a mystical conversation. And if we want to open up to that, we can. So that's, mystical conversation, altars, rituals. Those are a few tangible ways that I support those who I work with in creating meaning, because that's absolutely, as David Kessler wrote to in his most recent book, that's how we really heal, is making meaning. Putting the mosaic together and then figuring out what the meaning is.
That makes a lot of sense. So contextualizing being able to make sense of. So I'm going to go back to Ashley's question in a second, but Larissa said, my father is declining quickly with a rapid onset dementia just diagnosed a few months ago. I have two challenges. I feel I am grieving in real time as the man I knew my whole life is not there, and yet my dad is physically there. When I leave him, I am very sad. Second, I feel challenged to lead my young teens through their own concerns and grief when I feel unstable in mine. I've been very honest with them and have shared the joys and the moments I am having with my dad right now and the sadness of missing who he was. Any other suggestions to help myself and them, her kids?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Larissa, for what you shared. And I honor the depth and the magnitude of what you're going through. I too am navigating that in a different way with my dad, not dementia, but just starting to see memory loss. And it's, so I feel you in that. And I honor the responsibility that you have as a mother with your children. But I would just remind you to bring your energy back to your heart and to yourself, and to know that, you know, yes, you have these children here, but you have to take care of your you know, inner child, so that you can give to them and also take care of your father in the capacity that you are called to and asked to. But really, I would say the invitation that I'm intuiting is real for you, Larissa, is to continue to breathe, because I feel like there's so much emotion that's coming up with this. There's not just the present emotion of what's true for all of us. But yeah, really connecting with your breath and bringing your breath to your heart, and staying connected to your feelings. I hope that's helpful.
She says, thank you. Great. And Ashley asks, do you think there are a lot of people who don't believe they need a grief guide because they don't recognize their pain or issue with certain things? For example, what would happen in CBT for EDs? Is that eating disorders?
Mm-hmm.
If the patient shifted their view into an understanding of grief, do the invitations also help in familial therapy?
Yes, they certainly can. But I feel like there are a few questions that preceded whether or not the invitations can help in familial therapy, right, Talia?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Do you think there are a lot of people who don't believe they need a grief guide because they don't recognize pain or issues with certain things?
Sure, and that's 100%. And I think that's been this interesting thing of, you know, when I was on the early team at Thinks, the period proof underwear company that some of you may know, and I remember trying to talk to people about period proof underwear in 2013 or 14, and like women were like, my God, like I don't have a period, like that's like not something that I deal with. And it's interesting because I sometimes have that reaction with grief, but now it's like this exhale when I talk to people, even just within the past week and a half. It's like, oh wow, like yeah, I think that's what I'm going through, but I'm not for everyone, and I don't want to be for everyone. I do believe that the people that reach out to me are called to work with me in some way, or we're called to connect so that I can point them in the direction of who to best serve them. And your other question was about cognitive behavioral therapy and eating disorders. Is that right? Yeah, I mean, I think the invitations certainly complement CBT. And I do have a girl who's come to one of my workshops who is, her invitation has been to release, she's grieving, really using food as a coping mechanism. So she's really embracing the invitation to feel instead of numbing out with food. She's embracing, okay, how can I be with myself in this moment where I am, and breathe into the fullness of who I am without reaching for that thing, you know?
It sounds a lot like, yeah, like having to trust that you're not going to go crazy, or that you can just sit with yourself and you don't have to act on that obsessive tendency, and just sitting with that feeling, right? Don't they say like it's 3 or 4 seconds to truly feel something if you're really feeling it from beginning to end, and then it releases on an energetic
breathing through it and thanking it and sending it on its way.
But that a lot of people don't even allow themselves to sit, because we're, you know, so busy distracting or denying or trying something else, that so when we finally
I mean, it's not even about allowing. Sometimes it's just it's that awareness piece, right? And so coming into that.
Sorry.
Dash
to come in.
Do you want to introduce Dash, or?
Sure, Dash.
So sweet.
He's ready, but he's still
Dash. Yes. So I mean, it's a beautiful metaphor for what we're talking about. Like, we're holding that delicate and gentle and tender part of ourselves when we lean into our grief story. So,
thank you. Okay, Maria says, how do you locate the area where your grief is emerging from? I lost connection. So sorry if you already answered this question. For example, right now I have identified a broken heart, but don't understand where it came from, as I consider myself very strong. So I might have overlooked my emotions in the past.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think, I would say, you know, as you were just speaking to Talia, really just sitting and putting your hand on your heart and asking your heart to reveal to you where there is that sense of disconnect. And I'm a big proponent of miracles, and I believe that they're completely possible, and it's not about like a little miracle or a big miracle. Miracle is a miracle. But in terms of the question about heartbreak, I guess my question for you is this is a new feeling, or does it feel, are you intuiting that it feels old? Because I think it's really sitting with your hand over your heart and inviting, if you're open to that, inviting ancient wisdom to come through and to guide you into your healing, and remembering that like heartbreak equals heart make, you know, like you get to remake your heart when you have heartbreak, and it becomes stronger when you feel through the layers of the heartbreak.
Maria says it feels old.
Old and that makes sense, and how beautiful that that's coming forward so that it can be healed. You know, things that are coming forward are there because we're meant to move into them, and it takes courage to move into them. So I think you're ready to move into it. So meditate with it, sit with it, see where there are creation points, and it will be healed.
I feel like we have so many layers, and you think you've healed something. I always say it's like we're everlasting gobstoppers. There's like different flavors upon flavors, and you feel like you've healed a total issue, and then you do some work for a year or two, and that issue then pops up again in a deeper way to heal from a new perspective. But that's really
funny. Everlasting gobstoppers.
It's never ending.
Yeah.
Good. The wisdom comes from that, but you know, you never know how the issue will come back up. So anyhow, Lauren says, I find myself and others grieving periods of time in our lives. For example, my college years where I felt more spontaneous, or an old relationship that no longer feels appropriate, but may have been loving at the time. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that my thoughts are most immediately, I think it's a universal human experience. And I believe that if we're honest and present with ourselves, that's true for each of us. So I think the invitation for you is to go into what is it that's missed? Like, what is it that you're missing from that situation? And is it something that you can replicate? Is it something that is from your ego, or is it something that's coming from your heart? And is there a tenderness there because you need to do some healing work? Or maybe it's just that, you need to connect with those people that you went to college with. It can be as simple as that. But yeah, I don't know if there was more to that question.
Would you recommend, like, so if her desire is she misses like the college years of being spontaneous, is there like, can she try and be spontaneous in another way to get that? Is that something that she's missing that she can then replace? Or
Absolutely. And I think that's part of just giving ourselves the permission to have fun and to know that, healing happens when we can give ourselves the grace to go into what feels good and what makes us feel alive. And I think for a lot of us who went to college and we had those moments, that I feel like I can see pockets of what you're speaking to. It's that sense of liberation and freedom. So finding what that pathway is today for you. For me, I love the class. It's an amazing cathartic workout. And I get that sense of it just gives me the permission to go into some of the louder parts of myself. I think, the thing, I feel like maybe also what you're touching on is your wildness and that carefreeness that sometimes we have to disconnect from because we have different roles that require a certain level of responsibility. But taking care that is calling to you. So how to listen to it and how to take care of it. Because if you're shutting off to that part of yourself that's calling to you, you're shutting off. So yeah, you can't just shut off one part of yourself. So
I think that's really interesting. Oh yeah, Lauren said that's helpful. Thank you. I think it's interesting that you can, have grief in different ways, whether it's job loss or, a loss of a friendship or actual death, and then you can find a way to sort of recreate that feeling that you desire in another situation or amalgamation. If you miss so-and-so, you miss what about so-and-so, and then you can, in your own relationships with others, you can ask for that, or
yeah, I think what you're speaking to is connection, because there's the suffering in our grief is perpetuated through disconnection, and I think a lot of us are experiencing healing and a sense of relief from what's going on right now through something simple like Zoom, and I have friends doing virtual breakfasts, virtual dinners. It's there's a lot that we can do and tap into in terms of the healing power of connection, even though we have to be so disconnected from each other right now. And I think to what you're speaking to earlier, for all of us that have been, as we have all been impacted, if we have to take care of ourselves, and then also remember that healing comes in seeing where we can give and to be of service. So if that's, donating a box of diapers or donating to the food bank and showing up for one person is showing up for the collective. And even if we can't give a lot, that's part of healing. And that's part of staying connected and alive to our hearts. Because we have, a lot of us are in this place of scarcity and fear, and fear is grief. Like C.S. Lewis talked about in A Grief Observed, that nobody ever told him that grief felt so much like fear, So, but for some reason, fear is an easier word for people to say than grief.
Oh wow, so they're the same thing in your mind?
Well, I think they're related. If you think of grief as a composite of different emotions, and fear is definitely within that.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. I think, well, would you like to say anything else about any other parts of your work or your background, or does anyone have any questions or comments? Oh, Myrna says, can you go more into on what you meant if something is coming from your heart or your ego? That's a great question. I still don't know always.
Yeah, well, I can absolutely, and I think this is where intuition also comes in. But Myrna, if you're willing to share, is there a specific situation that you're asking about? Because if so, that would be helpful in terms of how I would guide my response, or not.
Oh, wait a second, in case
Yeah.
you're typing.
Yeah.
If she doesn't want to share, that's okay. She says, feeling unhappy because of what I think I need versus what I need. What she thinks she needs versus what she actually needs.
Okay. Yeah, so I think what I'm feeling into is maybe is there a sense of worthiness, or deservedness that is perhaps social expectations, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, permission to be fully you, and permission um, to expand that internal dialogue, right? The more that we lean into what's coming from our hearts, the more we hear our hearts, and just opening up that conversation with your heart will allow that channel to be more open. I think ego is everything that's I mean, we could do many hours on the ego, but I think I'm gathering that your intuition is really just to give yourself, I mean, my intuition for you with your question, Myrna, is really to lean into your heart and to give yourself the permission to take up space with your desires, and to take up space with what makes you happy, and to know that happiness is, while it is ephemeral, a lot of it does intersect with our heart, and just to breathe into what feels true for you. And if you're getting resistance, asking the resistance what it has to teach you or to show you. But ego and heart is, I think the more connected you are to your intuition, the more connected you are to your heart. There's a high correlation there. But there's healthy ego, and then there's ego that keeps us wrapped up in the machine forever. So I think we're all in this place where that's been shaken up.
Great.
Dash.
Is there anything else you would like to share, or any questions anybody else has? We'll be sending everyone a recording of this too, with some, I think, a discount code if anyone wants to do a one-on-one session.
Thanks, Talia. And thank you everyone for your questions. And my hope for all of you who've courageously been present, because I acknowledge that it takes a lot of courage to show up for this conversation. Grief still in our culture feels like an expletive to some. So honoring your courage and showing up for wherever you are on the spectrum of grief. And I hope that thinking about your grief as an invitation to growth is something that can really serve you, not just in these next couple of months while we're navigating COVID-19, but also in your lives, present and future. So yeah, I don't have anything else to say, but if you have any other questions, Talia, I'm open to answering any.